Welcome back for week four's video lecture. Want to go over a few things with you this week as we get to work on the comparison and contrast essay. Now, it's important to notice that both the comparison contrast essay and the next one, the cause and effect, these are going to be 2-week assignments, not just 1-week assignments. So you are going to have a little extra time. And in the first week, you're going to submit it's in quiz format, but it's not really a quiz. It's just a pre-writing exercise for this week for the comparison contrast paper. And then next week, the paper itself will be due. Same thing's going to happen when we get to the cause and effect essay. So just kind of keep in mind, those are your maybe more elaborate, I guess, papers, a little bit more involved. And so we are going to have a little additional planning and that kind of stuff. So this week, I want to focus on comparison contrast here in this lecture, definitions, how to put it together, how to choose topics, things of that nature. So with that in mind, I actually am going to use a PowerPoint this week, which I normally do not do, but we're gonna take a look at this together. So as I mentioned, we're talking about comparison contrast. The definition of the writing mode known as comparison contrast is to examine the similarities and differences of two subjects from similar class or genre. Now, the big thing there, compare means similarities, contrast means differences. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But the main thing here is that when we are choosing subjects for comparison, they do have to be similar in some way, or there's not much reason to compare them. So that's why the definition contains that phrase from similar class or genre. So a good example of this for me is always movies. You can compare two movies on a lot of different bases, but if you're writing a comparison contrast paper about movies, you typically will need to have two that have the same genre. They're from the same genre. So say two horror movies or two romantic comedies or two action adventure movies, not two completely separate types of movies, because it just doesn't make for a very good comparison contrast. So that's what we mean when we say similar class or genre. The process for writing a comparison is fairly simple. You choose the subjects, like two movies. You choose the criteria by which they'll be compared. We haven't talked a lot about that yet, but if I went ahead and talked about the movie example, let's say I was doing two romantic comedies and they had, there's always going to be a romantic lead, and usually male and female, not always. But there's going to be some kind of romantic couple that we are focused on. So that would be one of my criteria. Who are the actors? Who are the characters? The people in the film. I could also talk about the location. For example, back in the olden days, and you guys have probably still seen them because they still float around, but there were a lot of romantic comedies set in New York City. But then there was also a famous one starring, I think it was Tom Hanks and I've lost my brain. But anyway, there was one called Sleepless in Seattle, which of course was set in Seattle. And so if I was going to compare a movie set in Seattle with a movie set in New York, I could talk about that. Budget. Money is always a good comparison for any types of things, but was it a big budget movie? And also, how much money did it make? So money would be one of the categories. So you choose your subjects first, and then you think about the different criteria that you could use to compare them. We're going to look at another specific example here before we get done. You're going to note the similarities. As I mentioned before, similarities are synonymous with comparing, and the differences are synonymous with contrast. Sometimes you'll hear people just say compare, and they really mean compare and contrast. If you're looking at two movies that are very similar, you're going to focus more on the differences as you write about them. And if you're looking at things that are very different on the surface, you're going to probably focus more on the similarities so that you can showcase those in the compare part. So typically when we write comparison contrast, we do both. We look at how they are similar and we look at how they are different, but we may focus more on one than the other. So I've created a chart. That's always a good technique to use when you are pre-writing for a comparison contrast paper. And you can put your subjects in column A and column B. Now, I've used cars because this is something that we use sometimes without even knowing it. We do that kind of comparison contrast in our own lives. If we're looking at houses, for example, to buy, or apartments to rent, or schools to go to, books to read, right? We do this a lot in our brains. We may not make a chart about it, but that's essentially what we're doing when we're trying to decide between two things. So let's say I'm going to buy a new car. I'm either going to choose a Prius or a Corolla. I've just gone all Toyota. I don't know why. Well, because I drive a Prius, that's why. But I could put these in a chart and I'll have subject A is my Prius, subject B is my Corolla. And then I've also gone ahead and thought of some criteria that I could use to compare the two types of car, the two cars. Cost, of course, I mentioned earlier, most of the time when we are looking at things, especially when we're trying to make a decision about them, cost is definitely a big consideration. Reputation. You could, if you were doing this as a paper and you're researching, you might look up reviews of the different cars to see customer satisfaction, things of that nature. Consumer Reports magazine, of course, they have a website as well, is a great resource for that kind of comparison. If you are looking at products, you can look at reviews fairly easily. Safety, same thing. Most of those kinds of places that will share that information will also contain things like safety. Features. If I were car shopping, I can go on the Toyota website or whatever maker it is, and I'm going to find charts that show me those features. If you've ever shopped for, say, a computer, you may have utilized this kind of thing on a company's website. For example, I almost always buy my computers from Best Buy because I want to be able to take them to a place and go, here, fix this. So if I am going into Best Buy's website, it allows me to mark several computers and compare them, and it will make me a chart of those features. So I'm sure you've seen that kind of thing before that shows the differences between the two or more things that you may want to be looking at. And then I just use look. I know one of the things that I like in a car is a good color. Now, if I'm shopping between Toyotas, I'm probably going to get the same colors. But if you are shopping between, say, a Prius and a Nissan, then the colors selection is going to be a little bit different, the body shapes, that sort of thing. So this is a good way to start this week as you are looking at your pre-writing, is to make a chart for yourself, because it will also make sure that you have some criteria that you're comparing them by. Now, do you have to have 5? No. Do you have to have more than one? Yes. So I would say start with 3 criteria, 3, 4, or 5. I wouldn't do more than 5 because your paper doesn't have to be that terribly long. But somewhere between 3 and 5 criteria is going to be a good starting place for your comparison. When you're doing your information gathering, your research, it's going to be very similar to the research that we did with the exemplification essay, because typically when we're doing a comparison and contrast, we are looking for factual information, not necessarily opinionated information. Now, that's not always 100% true. I just mentioned reviews. Car reviews are not written from facts. They are written from people's opinions. If you ever look at movie reviews, for example, if you listen to some of the movie reviews, you might never go see a movie because there's always going to be somebody who hated it. So in general, we are looking for data. We are not necessarily looking for just somebody's opinion, but you are going to find that as well. With this paper, you are still going to be using the library primarily for your research. And of course, again, some of those reference sources that you looked at last time, if you're comparing people, for example, you may want to do sort of the same thing you did in the exemplification essay and look at their biographies in some of those reference sources. Now, the other question this raises is, are comparison contrast papers meant to be informative or are they meant to be persuasive? Typically, in general, when an instructor asks you to write a comparison and contrast paper, you are not necessarily saying this one is better and this one is worse. You are typically just demonstrating the informative side of this. And this paper is fairly true of that. Now, will we know which is your favorite between the two things that you're comparing? Probably. But I wouldn't focus on that until maybe the very end. In the conclusion, you could say, oh, and this is why I prefer Disney over Universal, or whatever the case may be. Now, when we make decisions, when we use comparison contrast in our own lives to make decisions, then we are typically trying to persuade ourselves of the pros and cons, right? So this car is better than this car. This is the one I'm going to buy. This is the one I'm not going to buy, because I have done that comparison and contrast. So comparison does help you make decisions and uncover which of two things might be your particular favorite. But typically when we are writing comparison contrast, we are maintaining a fairly objective, here's the information sort of style. And then letting the reader sort of decide for him or herself which one they think is better. But again, you probably will make that clear in the conclusion, which is absolutely fine. There are two ways to outline a comparison and contrast paper. They are called the block, and you'll see them called various things, but typically they're going to be referred to as block formatting and point-by-point formatting. So in a block format, you write everything you have to say about subject A and then everything you have to say about subject B. You still need to talk about the same criteria for all three, and you want to keep them in the same order. So if this was a paper and not just a paragraph, for example, then I might have 3 body paragraphs about subject A. I'd have an introduction, 3 body paragraphs about subject A, each one of the criteria, and 3 more paragraphs about subject B, and then a conclusion. In point by point, we organize it by the criteria rather than the subject. So I've only included 2 criteria on here, but probably you'd have at least 3. You may have more. That's one reason I wanted these to be a little different, because it's going to vary depending on what you're comparing. But in the point by point, you would have a paragraph about the criteria, the first criteria, and then you would talk about A and B. Same thing with 2, same thing with 3, on down the line. So one of the decisions you're going to make this week is which way it makes the most sense to you to organize your particular paper. And a lot of times it just depends on what the subjects are and what the criteria are. Sometimes it's very easy to cover both subjects in one paragraph. And so doing it by criteria, by point, makes sense. I'm thinking about the comparing to theme parks, for example. If you were talking, if one of your criteria is cost, there's no need to have necessarily 2 separate paragraphs about the cost of those theme parks. But when you get into more detail on criteria 2, for example, which might be the rides that they have, you're probably going to have more than 1 paragraph. So criteria organization helps you make sure that you're discussing both of the subjects under each criteria. Whereas blocks kind of make sense logically to people. So it's really up to you what you want to do. You are going to decide that this week, and you're going to give me a kind of rough outline, but you can always change your mind. All right, so I've got a sample of, now this of course is not an essay, it's just a paragraph, but I've got samples on what these would look like. So the first one is a block paragraph, block organized, about the Prius and the Corolla. Now I'm not going to read this to you, I'm going to let you read it. So give you a couple of minutes here to read this paragraph, and then we'll look at the point by point one. All right, so you may notice that the first half of the paragraph is mostly about the Prius and the second half is mostly about the Corolla. There's a little crossover here and there, but it is block format. Prius, Corolla. Check out the difference. So read this paragraph. So notice the information is roughly the same, but it goes back and forth every time on the two models and each of the criteria. So again, either works, even with the same subjects. So it's kind of up to you what you want to do. You are first going to choose your subjects and criteria, and we're going to look at we're going to look at the samples that were um, in the assignment. In fact, let's do that first. So these are the ones that I had given you as pre-approved kinds of topics. These are definitely doable. And they are also going to be fairly easily researchable. So the first one that I mentioned was two musicians of the same genre, and the sample criteria that I gave you were their fan base. I was honestly mostly thinking about this because I had Taylor Swift on the brain, and I was like, oh, the Swifties. A great thought about that would be two musicians who have a very vocal or very organized fan base. So even if you wouldn't, I guess they're both pop. I was thinking of Taylor Swift and Lady Gaga and because their fan bases would make really interesting connections there. Um, Critical reception, what do people say about them? What do people say about their music? Sales, of course, always money could be a possibility. Now, you are not limited in any way to those three, and I've only given you three samples for each one because I want you to come up with some of your own as well. One of the things, of course, that you could talk about with music is the lyrics or the style itself. Like that's something that you can focus on as well. Two movies. I mentioned this earlier. This is always a popular connection, and you can find connections beyond genre, but it does help if they are from the same genre. I mentioned location as one. Costuming is a big one, especially if it's a more historical type of movie. Critical reception, just like music. And of course, the acting, the character portrayals, the stars that are in them. One of the things that I was thinking about with this one was taking a character that has been played by more than one person and comparing a movie from each of them. So James Bond is probably the most obvious, that there have been different James Bonds over time. I was thinking about I was watching Silence of the Lambs the other day because it just happened to be on TV. And of course, Jodie Foster plays FBI agent Clarice Starling in that, but she did not play Agent Starling in any of the sequels. It switched over to Julianne Moore. So those might be kind of interesting to look at. I mentioned on the list 2 theme parks. We of course live in theme park land, but I want to caution you about trying to do too much with theme parks. So the more specific you can be, the better. So I give the biggest example. I would not compare Disney and Universal. If you wanted to compare Magic Kingdom with one of the sub parks of Universal, my brain just lost all those words. That might be something, but you could even choose 2 parks within Disney or the 2 parts of Universal. I know there's getting ready to be more parts, but right now the 2 parts of Universal. They don't have to be in Orlando. You could talk about theme parks that are elsewhere. You could also talk about theme parks that are similar in some other way. For example, parks that are focused on animals. So maybe Animal Kingdom and SeaWorld. Or one of the things that would be very interesting is to do some of the more off the beaten track theme parks. Our whole family is going to Gatorland soon, and I love Gatorland. It's one of my favorite places. It's just so fun. It's also a little hokey, but that's okay. There are certainly theme parks around the country that are not to the professionalism level of Disney or Universal. So kind of interesting there. You could even do just a special event. I mentioned special events as one of the criteria, but you could write a whole paper about, say, Halloween Horror Nights versus Mickey's Not So Scary Halloween Party. You could focus in on something that specific. You could also focus solely on rides, honestly. If you wanted to do, roller coasters, for example, SeaWorld has a lot, and so does the one in Tampa. I can never, ever, ever remember the name of it. I don't know why. It's just gone from my mind. But anyway, so you could focus on rides. Cost, of course, is going to be a big one. So I mentioned theme parks. I use that as the overarching, but there's a lot of things that you can play around with there. 2 holidays from different religions. And again, they have to have something in common. So I was thinking we just came out of Christmas. I was thinking of Christmas and Hanukkah or Christmas and Kwanzaa. There are certainly time-sensitive religious holidays in multiple places. So that would be an interesting way to do it. And what could you talk about with that? Food, of course, traditions, the popularity beyond adherence to the religion. I think that's a big one, because of course, not everybody who celebrates Christmas is Christian. We know that. In fact, it's just kind of a big holiday. But so that might be kind of interesting to do. They don't have to be religious holidays. You could talk about, say, for example, Thanksgiving and another country's traditions around gaining their independence, something along those lines. Independence Day, 4th of July, that kind of stuff. So look for interesting things. I think it's kind of fun to not just do the obvious. And then finally, I mentioned 2 athletes from the same sport. This is not unlike 2 musicians of the same genre, but those are also good things you can do. And some of you will have written about athletes in your exemplification. So you could continue down that road if that's something that you enjoy. So for this week, you're going to choose your subjects. You're going to choose your criteria. I would choose 3 to 5 criteria. Make a preliminary choice between the block and the point by point, and you're going to write out a rough outline. So it will look just like that one that I gave you, except it will not just say point 1 or subject A and subject B. It will actually have the information there. It doesn't have to be super elaborate, just a list of the things in the order that you think you're going to cover them. And then, of course, you're going to go ahead and conduct some research to gather sources. Keep and save those MLA citations. Of course, in the library, you get those with the sources because you're going to need them. You're going to include them in this quiz. And then, of course, you're also going to use the ones that you end up using in the paper will be on your works cited list. So those are your things to do in week 4, decisions to make, all of that fun stuff. So I will look forward to seeing you back here for another lecture video next week. In the meantime, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out. Take care, everybody.